All right, hello, this is Jason Kissel, and we are at Kokiwanee in Wabash County, mid-April, and your guide, who has the camera strapped to his head, is Dave Hicks, and he is a botanist, a retired professor, and he did a floral inventory of this property, so he not only knows the place really well, but knows the plants really well also. So you're just going to kind of tag along with us as we walk along, and the first conversation I think we're going to have is going to ask Dave to explain why they're out now. Why are these spring ephemerals? They look pretty dainty. You know, you look around at the trees, and except for the buckeyes, all the trees are holding back because it's still really cold. The leaves aren't out yet, but these dainty little flowers, these dainty little things are boldly saying, I'm here, I'm going to survive right now. Last night it was 25 degrees, it's going to snow tomorrow. So can you explain kind of their strategy, why they're growing now?
Sure. This is a great time to be a plant in a forest. The summer is not so good. Once the trees leaf out, and you can see that they're almost all leafless. There's a buckeye or two in the foreground, a buckeye or 6 in the foreground, and they're starting to leaf out, but the canopy trees are not up to much yet. So this is a great time to be a plant that lives in the understory. This is a time of year when there's lots of soil moisture. The trees are not doing much below ground. We tend to think of plants as existing above ground, but they have to get their resources from the soil. So the trees are not taking nutrients out of the soil, and they're available for uptake by these smaller plants. And probably most important, this is a time when there's a lot of light in the understory. During the summer, when these trees are fully leafed out, maybe 5% of the sunlight will get down to ground level. At this point, it's more like 85 or 90%. So there's a bunch of species that have evolved to capitalize on this window of favorable conditions in the spring, and they'll come up, they'll grow, they'll flower, set seed, and then mostly die back in the midsummer. So if you were to come out here in July, you'd see relatively few of the plants that we see at the moment above ground, photosynthesizing, flowering, and so on. So let's take a look at a few. We're down at the base of the bluff, and we've just come down the slope, and we're standing next to a sepia area. The leaves you see here are skunk cabbage. Skunk cabbage is actually, it's the middle of April. Skunk cabbage is actually much earlier than this. They've flowered, and now they're in the process of setting fruit, but the leaves come up after the flowers. It's kind of surprising to come out here late in the summer, and you can find the fruits, which are bright red berries, but the leaves have died back. So this is a plant that looks like 3 different kinds of plants at different times of year. The flowers by themselves, the leaves at this point, and the flowers being pretty inconspicuous, and then the fruits by themselves later. One thing that makes Kokiwanee interesting, the reason why it has a lot of plants is it has a lot of different habitats. I'm looking up toward the bluff. The top of the bluff is south facing. It has thin soil. These are limestone cliffs without much soil developed on them. And we have a lot of species because we have lots of different types of habitat. So in the space of just maybe 30, 40 yards, you can go from the dry bluff top down to this very, very wet seep where water wells out at the base of the cliff. Well, let's take a look at some of the species in flower. Well, let's start with one that's only in leaf. This is Hepatica, which is one of the earlier plants to flower. It's now past flowering, but what's very distinctive about it are the leaves. Hepatica, sometimes known as liver leaf, or liverwort even, because the leaves are reminiscent of the liver of an animal or a human. In medieval times, they had an idea in medicine called the doctrine of signatures. Plants were used to cure the organ that the plant resembled. This is kind of a religious idea that God gave diseases, he also gave us the cures, and he gave us a way to recognize them. So these liver-shaped leaves indicated this was a plant useful for liver disease. I like to think of plants as having behavior. They don't move around, but they have different types of growth patterns. And this plant has a very interesting leafing behavior. The leaves live about 1 year, So if we look, we might be able to find some old leaves from last year that are starting to shrivel up. And then these are the new leaves that are coming on.
Tilt your camera down just a hair. We're not quite capturing your hand, so I go ahead and tilt the whole thing.
Okay. So, how's that?
Now reach for it.
Okay. So,
Oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
yeah. So this is Hepatica, and these would be this year's leaves, and they've started to grow here in the early summer, early spring, I should say, just as last year's leaves are starting to die back. Next to it is a plant that's not quite in flower yet. This is called wild ginger, and you can see the bud. The flowers are pretty amazing. They're dark reddish brown. They're a maroon color, and they're down at ground level. So this plant is pollinated by beetles and small flying insects, midges and gnats. It has flowers that are not very conspicuous, but somehow they do manage to attract some pollinators. Then a little further back is a red Trillium. There are 5 species of Trillium here, and this is the only one that's really in very good flower at this particular time. But this is a red flowered Trillium called the toadshade Trillium, or Trillium sessile. Sessile in botany means a structure that doesn't have a stem, and so the leaves of this plant and also the flower don't have a stem. There's another red flowered species called prairie Trillium, which is probably not in flower yet, which does have stalks on the petals, on the leaves and on the flower. Okay. The buried stems have got tooth-like projections. I always thought it was because the petals maybe looked like your incisor teeth, but the name actually comes from the below-ground parts. And then a little further back, almost in the same view, is another one of the Trillium species. This is called Snow Trillium. This is a fairly unusual Trillium and a very early one to flower. At this point, it's past flower. Well, I'm going to crawl a little further up this slope and look at another plant with a very interesting leaf. This is the leaf of Bloodroot. It's again a very early species to flower, and it's probably past flowering. We're unlikely to see any with petals at this point, but the leaves are very distinctive. This is in the poppy family. Its scientific name is Sanguinaria canadensis. Sanguinaria means that it has some bloody aspect to it, and many members of the poppy family have got thick juice, thick latex, which sometimes is white or yellow. In this species, it's often red or sometimes orange or yellowish. The sap was used as a dye by Native Americans, and I've tried dyeing cloth with it, and it gives a very interesting golden orange color if you use it as a dye. So Sanguinaria canadensis in the poppy family.
So Dave, when you did your floral inventory here, how many seasons did you come out?
Many. Acres got the property in 2004. That's when I started. I finished in 2011, and the list was published in a scientific journal called Castania in 2012. Here's the plant I was looking for earlier. This is a plant called blue cohosh. It's a member of the barberry family. The flowers are pretty inconspicuous, as maybe you can see. They're yellowish to brownish. This is called Caulophyllum thalictroides, and it has a number of interesting characteristics. It's a plant in which the seed develops outside of an ovary. In flowering plants, typically the seed develops inside the ovary, so you have a fruit surrounding the seed. The seeds of this plant look like blueberries, but they're actually seeds that are not surrounded by an ovary. So that's very unusual. It's the only species of flowering plant I know which does this. The other interesting thing about it is that it has a number of medicinal uses. It does have some hormone-like compounds, and so it's used in modern herbal medicine. And I should say, and as a side here, if I mention the uses of plants for food or for medicine. This is, I guess I want to say, for entertainment value only, maybe is the way to put it. Some of these plants can be actually rather dangerous if used improperly, whether for food or medicine. Identifying the plant, getting the dosage right, preparing it correctly are really crucial. Even then, some of them can have side effects. From where I am kneeling, I can see some other plants in the background. The umbrella-shaped plants are May-apples. Some people call them mandrakes, but the mandrake of Europe is actually not closely related. They're May-apples also in the barberry family. They're not flowering yet, but when they come into flower, the plants that have two leaves will have a flower. You can see the bud here will have a flower between the pair of leaves. And then a little further back is a white trillium, and one of the 5 species here, Trillium grandiflorum, which is not quite in flower, but this will have a big white flower several inches across. So we're standing next to a small waterfall and the stream coming down from it. And down on the ground, growing kind of matted, but sometimes making a taller plant, is a buttercup. This one is called swamp buttercup, and the scientific name for it is Ranunculus hispidus, and it's in the buttercup family, the Ranunculaceae. So you can see the sepals and the bright shiny petals, lots of reproductive structures, stamens and pistils in the center of the flower. And right next door are some nice spring beauties in good flower. Oh, here's a species we haven't encountered yet. This is a spring cress, Cardamom bulbosa. It's in the mustard family, like toothwort. I don't know if you can see the flowers, but this is a very distinctive flower because, very distinctive family, because the flowers have 4 petals, and if you look very closely, they have 6 stamens in the center. This is sometimes called the family Cruciferae because the 4 petals make a cross shape. Bright green here is a plant that won't flower for a few weeks. As Jason mentioned, this is mid-April, and one of the great things about spring flowers is if you come back next week, you'll see a somewhat different set of plants in bloom. If you come back in 2 weeks, you'll see a different set, and so on. This is a plant called wild hyacinth, Camacia scaloidis, in the lily family in the broad sense. And when they flower, they have a very pretty purple to lavender flowers, blue to lavender flowers. This particular patch is the only one out here at Kokiwanee, at least that I've found. And it puts on a pretty good display, but we're a couple of weeks away from seeing the flowers.
There's a nice little patch.
Yes, here's a nice little patch of a plant that has a strange common name. It's called false Rue Anemone. It does look something like the Rue Anemone we saw earlier, but it's a much larger, taller plant with an above-ground stem that branches and has leaves. Scientific name of this is, I keep changing it, Endymion, well, at this point we'll cheat a little bit. While I'm looking it up, it's in the Buttercup family, so it's related to the false Rue Anemone and the Buttercup we saw earlier. And we'll pull out the cheat sheet here and find that it is Endymion biternatum is the current scientific name of it. Here's a plant that we're usually too late for when we take a field trip. This is another member of the barberry family. This is called Jeffersonia diphylla, or twin leaf. So you can see where that name comes from. Here's an odd little plant that's in the sunflower family. This is called a golden ragwort. And the thing I find intriguing about it is that the petals are purple on the outside, but when the flowers open, they're yellow like a dandelion. We're down on the riverbank, and we're looking at a population of Virginia bluebells, Mertensia virginica. They're in the family called the Boraginaceae, the heliotrope family maybe. Kokiwanee is an important area for plants for a bunch of reasons. There's many species here, and part of that is because there's so many different kinds of little microhabitats and so many environmental variations. It's also significant because there are several species that find their range limit in this area. I'm not absolutely sure this is a native population of bluebell, but if it is, this is one of the more northern populations in this part of the country. This is a species that's not known to grow wild in the state of Michigan, which is not all that far away, for instance. There's several other species in this area that also have their northern range limit around here. One of them is wild hydrangea, which we should find on the banks here shortly. I don't see any at the moment. Here's a nice look at the skunk cabbage patch in the seep at the bottom of the slope. Some nice bluebells on the bank above the river. Well, we'll stop and take a quick look at the stonecrop. Here's a plant that's not in flower yet. You can see some buds on it, so it won't be too long. This is a plant called stonecrop, or Sedum ternatum. It's in the same family as jade plant. So the middle of a stream in a non-desert area is kind of an unusual place to find it, but this is a typical habitat for this species. So you can see more of it on some of the other rocks. Then also in this area by the stream is another member of the Buttercup family called Meadowroo, Thalictrum dioicum, which has male and female plants. This is a male plant, and you can see the little pollen-producing anthers hanging down below the flowers, which are not very showy. They're wind-pollinated, and most wind-pollinated species are really pretty lacking in visual appeal. They don't have to attract in insects. There's a couple of growth forms of violets. They're called stemless and stemmed violets. It's kind of a misnomer because both kinds have below-ground stems or rhizomes. So this is yellow violet, Viola pubescens, and it's a stemmed violet. That means that the flowers are on leafy stalks. And then not far away is a stemless violet. This is common blue violet, Viola sororia, and the flowers are on leafless stalks. But the actual stems of this species is buried down in the ground. You'd have to excavate to find it.